Hello and welcome to this Elizabeth Unit 1 revision video, which is going to go over all the aspects of Elizabethan court and parliament that you need to know. Here is the list of the topics that you need to know from the exam board if you want to take a look through. This video has been made using the two A3 sheets on Elizabethan England Unit 1 that you should already have in your folders. Everything written in black is exactly what is on the sheets, and all of the notes written in red are additional points not on those sheets that you might want to write down on some post-it notes. Whilst you're watching this video, you might want to make a revision clock at the same time. If you're going to decide to do that, you can use these 12 headings and you can pause the video here to write these headings down. These go with what is on the PowerPoint as well. The first area that you need to know about is the background to her reign, which began in 1558 after the death of her sister Mary I. Now, Elizabeth was 25 when she became queen, and the 25 years before that happened had been incredibly turbulent in England, thanks to the marriage of her parents. Now, originally, her father, Henry VIII, had been married to a Spanish princess called Catherine of Aragon, but that marriage had only produced one heir, and that was Mary. Henry VIII had been really desperate to have a son. So after 20 years of marriage, he decided to try and get a divorce. And that wasn't easy at the time because England was a Catholic country and you had to get permission from the Pope, who refused. So her dad, Henry VIII, ended up breaking away from the Church of Rome and instead granted himself a divorce after creating the Church of England, which was a Protestant church. He then married her mother, Anne Boleyn, and that had enormous consequences for the whole of England because it changed the religion and caused enormous religious divides that lasted throughout Henry's reign and also the reign of his children. First of all, Edward, who went first, and then also Mary, and then obviously it affected Elizabeth's reign as well. Now, her parents had got married just before her birth in 1533. And that first act of succession was passed after she was born, which made her legitimate. Now, in lots of Catholic people's eyes, she was still always going to be illegitimate because they didn't believe in divorce, but still technically that meant she was next in line to the throne, and that pushed Mary behind her, despite the fact that Mary was the older child. However, in 1536, her mother Anne Boleyn was executed for a variety of crimes that Henry said that she was responsible for. Now, after that, Elizabeth fell from favour, and a second act of succession made her illegitimate. Now, as a result of this, she became politically irrelevant. Mary was back in line to be the first in line to the throne, and that then changed after her younger brother Edward was born with Henry's third wife. Now, generally, her childhood was quite difficult in the sense that she was exiled from court and she never really saw her father, but she did receive a brilliant and modern education because she was still a princess, even if she was now seen as being illegitimate and not really in line to the throne. She was still a royal child and therefore she was still treated pretty well. Her position improved under Henry VIII's sixth wife, a woman called Catherine Parr, and by 1544, a third act of succession restored her as an heir to the throne. But no one seriously expected Elizabeth to ever rule, because obviously, first of all, it would be her younger brother Edward, and then if he died without any children, it would then go to Mary. So it was unlikely that Elizabeth was going to ever rule. Now, during her siblings' reigns, she learned quite a lot. For instance, during the reign of her brother Edward, who became king when he was 9. Now, he was basically controlled by lots of older nobles, including people like Thomas Seymour. Now, Thomas Seymour was her brother's uncle, and there was accusations that went on during his reign about Elizabeth flirting and potentially having an affair with Thomas Seymour. Now, that was really bad for Elizabeth's reputation. Remember that people were supposed to remain pure until they were married. The allegations that she was with an older man really damaged Elizabeth and potentially influenced her in the future when it came to her relationships with men, and maybe might have even had a role in the fact that she didn't get married. In her sister's reign, Elizabeth really struggled because her sister obviously made England a Catholic country. Mary was very famous for burning 300 heretics or Protestants at the stake. Now, Elizabeth and Mary had a very tense relationship because obviously Elizabeth's birth had pushed Mary out of the line of succession and also had led to the divorce of her parents. And there is an element of Mary blaming Elizabeth for that. So during Mary's reign, Elizabeth was locked in the Tower of London for her suspected involvement in something called the Rebellion. That was a rebellion that happened when the English people weren't very happy about Mary marrying the Spanish king, Philip. Mary was also a very devout Catholic who never really trusted the Protestant Elizabeth, and Elizabeth knew that when she became queen, she wanted to avoid that kind of brutality. So that might have actually influenced her middle way when it came to religion. Elizabeth became queen in 1558 and had her coronation in 1559. Now, when she first became queen, she faced loads of different problems, including her gender. Now, at this point, there was enormous prejudice against female rulers, hence the fact that Henry VIII put so much effort into having a son, including changing the religion of England. If we think about the history of English queens, Mary I, Elizabeth's sister, was the first queen of England. This proved that it could be done, but didn't really inspire confidence because she wasn't a very successful ruler. People generally had horrible ideas about female rulers at the time and believed that women were weak and not intellectually or emotionally suited to reign. Monarchs were also expected to have traditional masculine characteristics of doing things like showing physical strength, assertiveness, and decisiveness, which weren't characteristics associated with women. So many people at the time saw her gender as a real issue. They questioned her ability to rule because she was a woman. And even in the year that she first became queen, 1558, there was a book that was written by a man called John Knox, who was a Scotsman, who said that women ruling was repugnant to nature and an insult to God. And many people at the time felt this way. So she had that as a key challenge. Her next key problem that she faced was about marriage. She was unmarried and therefore had no heirs. Many people were worried about this and what would happen to England. But obviously, if she did get married, that would limit her power because her husband would be expected to rule in her place. So it was very difficult for Elizabeth to balance those issues. There was also an issue of inexperience. She hadn't been prepared to rule because people didn't expect her to. With Edward being born a few years after her, people expected him to have a long life and then have lots of children who would then rule after him. Even if it wasn't going to be Edward, people then expected that Mary would be able to rule after him and that she would have children who would then take the throne after her. So Elizabeth didn't grow up with the kind of education that you might expect for somebody that's expected to be the next ruler of England. Another key problem is because a lot of people don't see her as a legitimate potential queen. And that is because for the Catholics, they don't believe in divorce, especially after the Pope had refused to allow the divorce between Henry and his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, to allow Henry to legally, in their eyes, marry Anne Boleyn, which was Elizabeth's mother. So therefore, she had to deal throughout her entire reign with lots of her enemies saying that she was illegitimate. There was also problems from her predecessor Mary's reign as well, because Mary left Elizabeth with enormous debts, a war with France and no allies. Elizabeth also inherited England at a time when England was unpopular with Spain, Scotland and Ireland. About with Spain in particular, the fact that she had made it a Protestant nation, that was going to be very difficult for them to accept. There's also the big issue of Mary Queen of Scots, which is absolutely linked to this idea of religion. For some people, and for some Catholics in particular, they saw Mary as the rightful next Queen of England, even though she was already Queen of Scotland. For a lot of people, they would prefer to have a Catholic monarch on the throne than have somebody that they saw as illegitimate. And obviously, Mary was a real threat throughout the reign. We think about all of the Catholic plots that happened in the 1570s and 1580s. For instance, things like the Northern Rebellion, and things like the Ridolfi plot, Throckmorton, Babington, all of them were about putting Mary on the throne. There were also issues with poverty, which came up again, particularly from the 1590s, and the threat that the poor might rebel against Elizabeth. Elizabeth knew that she was going to have to raise taxes, and that was going to prove unpopular. So when she becomes queen, she is dealing with all of these different issues and has to solve them as quickly as possible. The next area that we're going to focus on is thinking about how Elizabeth ruled and what organisations and groups helped her to rule successfully, at least for the majority of her reign. Now, you should remember seeing this document before, where we can see that God is at the top of the social hierarchy because they believe in divine right, they believe that God makes all of the decisions and that God decides who is going to be the monarch. In the case of Queen Elizabeth, she is the most powerful person in England at this time. You can see that she is the one that is in charge, for instance, of all the law courts. She's the head of the church. She appoints lots of different people that are then below her in the social hierarchy. We're going to talk through all these groups, but just give a quick overview to start with. Now, the first group to be aware of is the court, and it's important to remember that that group is different to government. They are the people that surround Elizabeth, that live with her, and we're talking about up to 1,000 people here, from servants all the way up to the nobles. We also have the Privy Council. Now, the Privy Council are really important to know about because they're responsible for the day-to-day running of the country. They were Elizabeth's main advisors. Elizabeth could choose them, but she did have to make sure that she appointed some powerful landowners to prevent rebellion. We also have Parliament as well, who are called by Elizabeth. Parliament did have influence over tax and was responsible for passing laws, but the Queen could decide how much advice of theirs she wanted to listen to. She could also just decide not to call them, and she could also issue a royal proclamation to pass a law if they wouldn't pass the laws that she wanted. And then you can see other elements of the government, for instance, the fact that she is appointing Lord Lieutenants, who are basically people that help keep law and order in different places, including the Justices of Peace as well. So each county basically had several Justices of Peace to ensure that order was kept, and these were generally selected from the gentry, which was rich people that didn't have a title. They ensured that the laws passed by Parliament were enforced. So go back and have a little look at that diagram if you want to just remind yourself about some of those key areas of Elizabeth's government. The first area of Elizabeth's government that you need to know in depth is the court. Now, remember that the court is not government, they are two separate things. But if you wanted to have power in Elizabethan England, you needed to be near the Queen because she decided what role she was going to give to different people. So the court moved wherever the Queen was. Involved groups like the Queen's household, so for instance, people like her servants, her ladies in waiting. It also included up to about 500 nobles, advisors, ambassadors, and also other nobility and the gentry in some cases too. People like the key privy councillors would make sure that they were there at court and they would live there, and the people that attended court were known as the courtiers. Now, it's important to understand the court was the centre of political power in England. It was really important to be part of this and make sure that you were visible here if you wanted any kind of political power. The court was also a social hub, providing the Queen with a home and entertainment. It also acted as powerful propaganda for her here and also abroad. Would hold really elaborate ceremonies and banquets and musical performances and plays, and these all glorified Elizabeth's image and encouraged loyalty and obedience from the people that visited the court. We're also going to think about how the court would sometimes move. Now, this isn't already on your A3 sheet, so it'd be worth writing it down on a post-it note and sticking it over the royal court. Elizabeth spent most of her time in Whitehall Palace, but she did occasionally like to leave Whitehall and go to other places around the country to stay with her nobles. Now, these were organised by one of her key privy councillors called Christopher Hatton. These progresses were when the Queen and her court went to stay with powerful nobles. Now, this was very expensive to entertain and host the Queen. It wasn't just the Queen who would come, it was often up to 500 wagons of her stuff and lots of her royal court. So you'd be entertaining 100 or 200 people, or even sometimes more than that if you hosted the Queen. Some nobles even did things like building brand new houses just to be able to entertain the Queen properly. Now, despite the fact that it was very expensive, nobles really liked it because it gave them access to the Queen. And remember, access to the Queen equals power. That's why the court was such an important aspect of who had the power in England, even though it's not technically a role within government. It also helped Elizabeth as well, though. It wasn't just the nobles that liked it, but Elizabeth too. Because first of all, the progresses were a propaganda opportunity for the Queen, for her to show her wealth and status, for her subjects to be able to see her. It was a really exciting time for people to be able to hear that Elizabeth was on a royal progress and you might get a glimpse of her. Remember that there was this kind of cult status around Elizabeth as being Gloriana, and people wanted to go and see her. It also helped Elizabeth stay in power, as it would ensure loyalty from her subjects, because staying at their homes would flatter them and make them feel important. It also brought her into close contact with her subjects and saved money this way. And sometimes it was just really practical. For instance, if the palace needed a thorough cleaning, she could go and stay with somebody else for a while. The next area of her government is arguably the most important, because this was the group that organised the day-to-day running of the country and helped Elizabeth rule. Now, the Privy Council had always been a key group, and Elizabeth's first important task when she becomes Queen in 1558 was to try and choose her Privy Councillors. She ended up choosing 19 of them, half that she chose from Mary's Privy Council to try and maintain experience, and half were new because she wanted to reward with loyalty and also make sure that she hired people that were also able as well. So the Privy Council were responsible for the day-to-day running of the country. Members were generally taken from the nobility, the gentry and the church. They were a group that met almost daily until they lived as part of the court and helped Elizabeth run the country. They helped to coordinate government and did important jobs like the administration of government. They also oversaw the policies on religion, economy, the military, foreign policy, and even things like the Queen's security as well. Remember that Dudley was master of the horse. Historians think that they were absolutely crucial to Elizabeth's success as they advised the Queen. There were lots of key Privy Councillors that Elizabeth trusted with her life, for instance William Cecil or Lord Burleigh. Elizabeth did make the final decisions, but the Privy Council often worked with her, and they could also issue proclamations in the Queen's name, and these would become law. Could also do things like arresting and imprisoning individuals, and they also guided and basically tried to manipulate the Parliament for Elizabeth. So they were an absolutely crucial group to helping Elizabeth maintain control of the whole country. And when Elizabeth loses her foremost trusted Privy Councillors, she's less successful in that last 15 years of her reign. So we can see the importance of her selecting a good Privy Council. Elizabeth chose 19 Privy Councillors at the start of her reign, but these are the 4 that you need to know about. In your folders you have a little fact file on each of them and why they were important to Elizabeth. The first one and main one to know about is William Cecil, who was her most trusted advisor. He was a Protestant like Elizabeth, and he was also a member of the gentry, which means that he was somebody that was largely wealthy but didn't have a title. However, Elizabeth gave him one in 1571 as a result of his dedication to her, and he became known as Lord Burleigh afterwards. Now, he was somebody that Elizabeth really trusted. The Queen felt that she could rely on him for any kind of honest advice, and at times she would listen to nobody but Cecil because he was so admired and respected. Elizabeth relied on him a lot because he had lots of similar views to Elizabeth, and so was passionate about helping her to achieve her objectives. He helped Elizabeth to pass significant laws, such as the religious laws, when it came to the religious settlement in 1559. She also relied on him when it came to manipulating Parliament, because he was a skillful manager in the House of Commons. He was so important to Elizabeth that she refused to let him retire, and eventually, after he dies in 1598, she ends up replacing him with his son Robert Cecil as Chief Minister, who lacked his father's skill. And that ended up causing the Essex Rebellion in 1601. Now, he wasn't the only important Privy Councillor. Elizabeth also really adored Robert Dudley, who was the Earl of Leicester. Now, he was a Puritan and somebody that generally didn't get on with William Cecil, Lord Burleigh. He was somebody that was important to her because he had been a childhood friend, and they'd actually spent some time together in the Tower of London during Mary's rule. There had been lots of rumours of romance between Elizabeth and Dudley over the years, especially in 1560, after Dudley's wife mysteriously died after falling down the stairs. Some people suggest that Elizabeth had a role in this, although there's no proof. As a result of that, Elizabeth could never marry him because the scandal would be too much and could cost her her rule. Instead, she decided to make him master of the horse, which meant that he was responsible for her safety and was very close to her. She was devastated when he died in 1588. Another really key person for Elizabeth was Francis Walsingham. He was a member of the gentry and he was also a Puritan as well, like Dudley, and there was some alliance that went on between these two figures. He was somebody who had to flee to Italy during Mary's reign because of his religious views and the fact that he was an extreme Protestant. He ended up entering Parliament though in 1558. He was somebody that was fiercely loyal to Elizabeth and she trusted him greatly, even giving him responsibility for foreign affairs. He even became an ambassador in Paris for a while. He was also really important to her because he was in charge of her secret service, and as you know, there were lots of threats to Elizabeth's life over the years, including things like the Babington plot. He was somebody that saved her life because he uncovered numerous plots and managed to stop them before they were put into action. Elizabeth was devastated when he died in 1590 because he'd been such an effective member of her parliament for her and such an effective Privy Councillor. The last one to know about is Christopher Hatton. You don't need to know as much about him as the other three, but he was somebody that was still important to Elizabeth. He was a member of the gentry, had been promoted, and therefore was totally loyal to her. He was also captain of the Queen's bodyguard. His most important role in the Privy Council was about helping her organise the progresses, which we know are really important for propaganda and also a practical measure for Elizabeth as well. He also, just like Cecil, helped to try and control MPs in Parliament and had even become Lord Chancellor in 1587. Elizabeth again was devastated when he died in 1591. So you can see all of these key figures had started to die from 1588, and Elizabeth was truly devastated with each one of their deaths, but especially Cecil, where she locked herself in her room and became very depressed afterwards. Another area of government that you need to know about is how she used the system of patronage, which she used incredibly effectively at the start of her reign. For instance, Elizabeth had the right to appoint whoever she wished to help her rule the country, and she used a system of patronage when it came to things like who had monopolies on certain goods, but also who was able to be a member of the Privy Council and have power in England too. Now, she was really effective at using this at the beginning. She ended up showing favouritism to certain men by giving them particular jobs, which would give them wealth and prestige, and therefore buy their loyalty. He knew that if they wanted any kind of power and status or wealth in Elizabethan England, that they had to be close to Elizabeth, hence why so many people wanted to be on her Privy Council or at least part of her royal court. And if they couldn't achieve either of those, then they wanted to have her visit them with one of the royal progresses. Now, Elizabeth was very skilled with patronage and managed this carefully. She played a game of divide and rule incredibly successfully. She would basically hire men who had opposing views and create rivalries and factions within her government to try and make sure that it meant that those men were competing with each other for affection. And this would then support her by making sure that they didn't gang up against her. Previous monarchs had had difficulties with factions where they couldn't manage them effectively, but for Elizabeth, this helped her rule even more successfully. For instance, having different groups of people with different ideas would mean that they would give her contrasting advice, which she could then take on board both sides of the argument and she could use to make measured decisions. It would also mean that she'd always have some support no matter what she decided. Now, technically, it is quite a corrupt system in a way, but it did ensure loyalty to her. It made them completely dependent on her and kept them in competition with one another, and therefore helped keep her in power. Now, she was also very harsh with people and wasn't afraid of showing if somebody had displeased her. For instance, there were some people that had displeased her that ended up in the Tower of London, and she even executed 2 of her Privy Councillors for treason. Norfolk, after his involvement in the 1569 Northern Rebellion, and then him getting involved again in the 1571 Ridolfi plot, he was executed for treason, despite the fact that he was the most powerful English noble at that point. And she also executes the Earl of Essex in 1601 for him starting that rebellion against her. So it was a really important system that made people totally loyal to Elizabeth and ensured that she remained at the heart of the political system. Now, it's important to remember that for your exam on Elizabeth, there are 4 different question types, one of which is the write an account question, which would expect you to show knowledge of change over time. Remember that Elizabeth is ruling for 45 years, and therefore there is some change in how successful she was over time. At the beginning of her reign, she used the system of patronage incredibly effectively, and her government ran quite smoothly, despite the fact that there were lots of different competing groups and people with very different views. However, from 1588 onwards, after her trusted force start to die, beginning with Dudley, she then becomes much less successful, and definitely from 1598, after the death of Cecil, it goes really downhill, and obviously we get her not using patronage very effectively, because that's one of the reasons why the Earl of Essex even starts a rebellion, because he's very angry about Robert Cecil being promoted to a position that he didn't think he deserved. The next key area that you need to know about for Unit 1 is about the marriage issue. One of Elizabeth's biggest headaches as Queen was the issue of marriage and the succession, and she faced constant pressure from both MPs and her Privy Councillors to marry. Now, there was lots of reasons why the marriage issue was so important and why it cropped up so many times in Elizabeth's reign. First of all, without a clear successor and son, the country could descend into civil war when Elizabeth died. Had happened in the past with something called the War of the Roses, which had only ended when Elizabeth's grandfather, Henry VII, had become the king and united the two houses that were fighting together. Women were considered weak as well and not capable of ruling a nation on their own. So there were a lot of people that wanted her to marry because they believed that a strong marriage would bring some stability to the country. If she chose to marry somebody from abroad, could also really help England by building an alliance with a strategic partner, and it would help ensure that they were stronger in the future. Hence why Mary had married King Philip of Spain, even though that had caused problems. Furthermore, if she did get married, that meant that she could have a child. Remember that they wouldn't be allowed to have a child outside of marriage. And a child would ensure that Protestantism and the Tudor dynasty would continue after Elizabeth's death. Remember that she's the last of the Tudor children and the last child of Henry VIII. As you know, there were lots of reasons why Elizabeth should have got married that we've already discussed. But there were also lots of reasons why Elizabeth didn't want to get married. And the first one was that marriage would limit Elizabeth's personal freedom. She would have to share power with her husband, and she would be expected to be quite submissive with her husband and listen to his views. Another issue is that Elizabeth wanted to have a Protestant take the throne from her next, but most suitable candidates for marriage, most of the leaders of other countries, were Catholic, and Elizabeth was Protestant, which would cause enormous issues between them. There was also a problem that if she married a foreigner, that might upset other countries who might feel overlooked by England. Furthermore, when Mary, her sister, had married a foreigner, Philip of Spain, that caused a rebellion in England called the White Rebellion. Philip of Spain had also treated Mary badly, and Elizabeth didn't like the idea that she would have to listen to a foreign husband. If she wanted to avoid that problem of marrying a foreigner, she could try and marry an English person, but that would be very difficult because technically all men in England are her subjects and should be below her. But if they got married, then they would technically be above her, and that would cause a power imbalance between them. It might also unbalance the different groups at the royal court and could cause a rebellion from disgruntled noblemen or members of the gentry. Furthermore, if we think about her childhood, her own experience of marriage and what she had seen had not been positive. Her dad, Henry VIII, had killed two of his wives, including her own mother, Anne Boleyn. Instead, Elizabeth decided to claim that she was married to her country and refused to name a successor because that might put her in danger. Elizabeth's response to the marriage issue was to hesitate for years and to try and keep people guessing at home and abroad as to who she would choose and whether or not she would marry at all. Her Parliament and Privy Council became very frustrated with this, and they tried to pressure her to marry. In 1566, she famously lost her temper when they tried to raise the issue again. They'd been very worried because in the early 1560s, Elizabeth had a very bad case of smallpox and it seemed that she might die. They were very worried that this was going to cause a civil war if Elizabeth died without an heir. But Elizabeth became very outraged at them and ended up saying the famous line about it's monstrous that the feet should direct the head, that basically they shouldn't tell her what to do because they're only her subjects. After this, Parliament was then no longer allowed to discuss the marriage issue at all. Now, at first, Elizabeth saw that there were many advantages to marrying, but as she got older, she came to see that actually marriage might disadvantage her in lots of ways. Now, one of the reasons why she was expected to marry was because of her gender, which was seen as a disadvantage to being a ruler. But over time, she came to see her gender not as a disadvantage, but actually as a useful political weapon. It allowed her to charm and manipulate, and also doing things like avoiding situations she disliked and decisions she didn't want to make. It even helped her to create this powerful cult of personality and this propaganda image of her as the Virgin Queen and Gloria. There were some suitors that she considered more seriously than others, and there are three that you need to know about in particular. The first one that she seriously considered was King Philip of Spain, who was the Catholic king that had been married to her sister Mary. Now that would have helped England at this point because Spain was the most powerful country in Europe, so it could have been useful. But Elizabeth was very wary of him because he was a Catholic, and also because she knew that when her sister had got married to him, it had caused the White Rebellion, which could have overthrown her. So she was quite worried about Philip as an option and ended up rejecting him, which was one of the long-term causes of the Spanish Armada, which was launched in 1588. Another person that she did consider was Robert Dudley, who was the Earl of Leicester and her childhood friend. Now, he'd been one of the Queen's favourites for a long time, and they'd been friends since childhood. His wife had died in 1560, and so it seemed like marriage could be possible between them. However, Elizabeth could never marry him, not only because he was a subject and below her, and that would have caused massive issues, but also because his wife had died in mysterious circumstances. She had been found at the bottom of the stairs with a broken neck, and there had been some people that had claimed that Elizabeth had sent somebody to do it so that she could marry Dudley. If she had married him, it could have caused a massive scandal and caused her to lose her position. Remember that Mary, Queen of Scots, had married somebody that supposedly had a role in her second husband's death, and that had cost her her throne. So Elizabeth was very wary of the fact that scandals could lead to you losing your position, and so she decided to never marry him. The last serious suitor that she considered was Francis, who was the younger brother of the King of France. Marriage might have been good for England if she'd chosen him, because it would have been good for England's relationship with the Catholic France. However, after a massacre of French Protestants in 1572, there was a strong anti-French feeling in England and the negotiations were called off. So Elizabeth never really seriously got to the point of marrying one of those three. Instead, she used the possibility of marriage as a diplomatic tool. Marriage negotiations were helpful for her when it came to foreign policy because, for instance, keeping them guessing about whether she was going to marry the French prince meant relations with France improved. Certainly by the time that she gets to her 50s, when we're thinking about the 1570s, her cult status as the Virgin Queen was established. This was already decided that she couldn't then get married afterwards because she was using the single status to her advantage. She said she was married to her people in her country, and by the time we get to the 1570s, she's too old to have children. So getting married wouldn't help them with the succession issue, which was one of the key things that they were thinking about when she first became queen in 1558. By the end of Elizabeth's reign, the succession crisis had resolved itself almost by accident, as many of the eligible contenders had died. For example, Mary, Queen of Scots, had been killed in 1587 after her involvement in the Babington plot. Elizabeth ended up choosing James VI of Scotland to be the next King of England. He was the only child of Mary, Queen of Scots, her cousin. But she still delayed announcing James as her heir until very end of her life because she was worried that there would still be plots against her. Thanks to the work of Robert Cecil, the succession ran smoothly, and this was the first time that the whole island of Great Britain shared a single monarch. We're now moving on to using your second A3 sheet for Unit 1 and discussing Parliament between 1558 and the end of Elizabeth's reign. Now, Parliament and her relationship with them changed over time, and on the next slide we'll think about the negatives and about things worsening, particularly from the late 1580s and into the 1590s. So Parliament, from the beginning of her reign, consisted of lords, bishops and other nobles who sat in either the House of Lords or the commoners, the MPs who sat in the House of Commons. Now, Elizabeth didn't really like Parliament at all. She viewed it as a necessary evil or an inconvenient necessity, and we can see that by the fact that she only called it 13 times in 45 years. Now, it was a key branch of her government, but not one that Elizabeth liked to rely on because she couldn't always ensure the loyalty of these people. Instead, she preferred to put her trust in her Privy Council, who were responsible for the day-to-day running of the government. Parliament's main functions were these three here, and therefore they did have a role that she needed to keep them for, particularly this idea of using them to raise taxation, because the Queen had to ask the permission of Parliament in order to raise taxes, and it was her main reason for calling Parliament, and was responsible for most of the time she called it in 45 years. It also could be used to give her advice, and it was a point of contact between local and central government, although she preferred to listen to her closest advisers rather than trusting Parliament. Furthermore, it did have another role because it could pass laws. However, the Queen could still issue a royal proclamation in order to bypass them if they said no to something. Elizabeth didn't really like the fact that these men felt that they could have any kind of say in her reign, and she even said over the marriage issue that it's monstrous that the feet should direct the head, and didn't like the idea of them telling her what to do. But they could discuss certain issues. She knew that they still had a key role, and therefore allowed them to discuss things like economic issues, social problems, and local matters on their own. She wanted them to have permission from her to discuss what she saw as the really crucial issues in England, including religion, foreign policy, marriage, and the succession issue. Now, in 1576, an MP called Peter Wentworth demanded that the MP should be allowed to talk freely about all subjects, including things like religion. Elizabeth wanted to make a show of the fact that she had more power than them and that they shouldn't be allowed, and therefore she imprisoned him in the Tower of London. So when we think about how powerful was Parliament at this point, it wasn't that powerful in comparison to the Queen and her Privy Councillors and the nobles that helped her control it. Elizabeth ended up having to make sure that she controlled them as much as possible and taught them what their place was. She ended up bullying the MPs to try and control them, for instance what she did with Wentworth when she sent him to the Tower of London, but she also was very careful to try and make sure that she also used flattery to make sure that they didn't start any kind of rebellion. So she often would visit Parliament and try and make sure that she basically wooed them and tried to use her gender as a political tool to her advantage. So, for instance, she says the very famous line about how she doesn't intend to see windows into men's souls when it comes to things like religion. So she uses both flattery and bullying to try and keep control of the MPs, and she does it largely successfully in the early years of her reign, up until the late 1580s. Her relationship with Parliament started to change by the time that we get to 1590s. Now, Elizabeth did remain in control of Parliament throughout her reign, but she was challenged more and more by the House of Commons in particular over time. That's because the MPs began to be much more confident and decided that they wanted to try and influence her decisions more. That could have been because they were better educated than they had been in the past. The MPs were also supposed to have three special privileges or rights as well. They were supposed to have freedom of speech, to be able to discuss anything that they wanted to, and so they became increasingly frustrated that there were topics that were banned from discussion. They were also supposed to be free from arrest, and no MP could be arrested or imprisoned while Parliament was meeting. And obviously Elizabeth had gone against that when she'd arrested people like Peter Wentworth. They were also supposed to be free to discuss their own ideas for new laws, but Elizabeth didn't let them discuss certain issues, for instance about marriage and foreign policy. So there were lots of heated debates that took place between Elizabeth and her Parliament, especially in the 1590s, when there were lots of outside issues that were placing increasing pressure on them. For instance, there had been loads of problems with harvest failures, particularly in 1594 and 1598. And that, combined with a growing population, which had increased by 43%, put a lot of pressure on Elizabeth and the MPs to do something about it. So the last 15 years of her reign are sometimes talked about by historians as the second reign of Elizabeth, where she was less successful generally in ruling, but also in her relationship with Parliament. It might be because her trusted counsellors had begun to die off, and they had been quite important in helping Elizabeth manage Parliament successfully. They'd done things like steering the debates in the direction that Elizabeth wanted. There was also a new generation of councillors who had intense rivalries. For instance, Robert Cecil, who was Lord Burleigh, William Cecil's son, and the Earl of Essex. That resulted in things like the Essex Rebellion. Some historians have suggested that Elizabeth lost control of Parliament in the 1590s, and some have even gone as far as suggesting this eventually led to the civil war between Charles I and Parliament in the 1640s. It certainly is true that Elizabeth did struggle more with Parliament later on in her reign, and we can see that she ended up giving in to them more than she used to previously. For instance, we've got an example here of her granting concessions to MPs on monopolies in 1601. She did that to try and appease Parliament in order to raise taxes to fund activities in Ireland. There are more examples of her giving in to Parliament later on, but remember, she was still always more powerful than Parliament was. It's worth stressing that historians often refer to the last 15 years of her reign as her second reign, where she faced greater problems and was less successful at dealing with them. It's really important to remember that for the write and account questions, which expect you to have knowledge of change over time. So I'm just going to very quickly talk through the increased problems facing Elizabeth from 1588. As we've mentioned, there's economic problems. We've already discussed the fact that there's harvest failures, and you'll look at that more when you look at Unit 2. There were also the problems of increased poverty as a result, and even the cost of rent had drastically increased at this time. There's also massive political problems, as we've already mentioned, with the fact that her 4 key Privy Councillors all die between the years of 1588 and 1598, and the people that Elizabeth chooses to replace them with are not necessarily looked upon as favourably. So her system of divide and rule that she used in her Privy Council and court was not as effective in the 1590s as it had been during the early years of her reign, which is one of the things that had led to the Essex Rebellion. Not only had the deaths meant that divide and rule was not as successful, but also it affected Elizabeth deeply. She became increasingly angry and depressed, and there were some people that started to sense that she'd reigned for too long and wanted reform and a new monarch. And obviously the political problems had led to rebellion as well. Essex, who had been one of her favourites in the 1590s and a key Privy Councillor, ended up organising a rebellion against her and Robert Cecil in 1601. The rebellion did fail and didn't have very much support, but it was still a sign of Elizabeth's weakening political grip. We're going to think more about that Essex Rebellion now. The first area of the Essex Rebellion that you need to know about is the causes, which tells us a lot about how Elizabeth's government was run and the fact that she was less successful over time. The first cause was about Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, being very jealous over the favouritism of the Cecils. He wanted to be Elizabeth's most powerful minister, which would then help him be able to have great wealth and status. He was only 29 years old in 1596, and a great future seemed to lie ahead of him. He wanted to make sure that he would be able to help rule Elizabeth run the country as she grew older. But the obstacles to those ambitions were William Cecil and his son Robert. Now, whilst the Earl of Essex was away fighting the Spanish in 1596, Elizabeth made Robert Cecil her new head of state, and Essex was furious. That shows that she wasn't using the system of patronage so effectively as she had been before. Now, rivalry between Essex and the Cecils dominated life at court for the next 4 years. In 1598, Essex asked Elizabeth to appoint one of his supporters as Lord Deputy of Ireland. Now, Elizabeth refused to do this, and Essex lost his temper and shouted out that her conditions are as crooked as her carcass, and then he turned his back on her. Now, that wasn't allowed in Elizabethan court because it was a sign of disrespect, so Elizabeth then supposedly punched him in the ear. Essex nearly drew his sword, which we can see in this painting here, and then stormed out of the meeting. Now, that again was a sign of disrespect. Essex, as a result of that, ended up being banned from court. Now, he didn't return to court until 1599, when Elizabeth gave him a second chance after William Cecil had died. So he comes back to court in 1599. Elizabeth gave him another chance to impress her. There had been a rebellion that had been started in Ireland by the Earl of Tyrone, which had broken out, and so Essex was ordered to go and defeat the rebels. He landed in Dublin in 1599 with 17,000 English soldiers, but against the Queen's orders, he made peace with Tyrone. He also rewarded many of his supporters by making them knights without her permission. Now, Elizabeth was furious when he returned to England and tried to order him to attack and defeat the rebels despite the peace that he's already made. Essex had found out that Robert Cecil had been given another important job in the government and decided to burst into the Queen's bedchambers before she was wigged and gowned. Again, another sign of disrespect. Now, Elizabeth was furious with this. She ended up saying that this was the final straw. The next day, Essex was ordered to appear before the Privy Council and had to stand for 5 hours whilst he was interrogated. Later, charges were brought against him, which were read to him while he had to listen while he was on his knees. Now, for somebody as arrogant and proud as the Earl of Essex, that was too much for him. He was then banned from court, and in the end, when his monopoly on sweet wines had run out, Elizabeth refused to renew it. That was really bad for the Earl of Essex, who was actually already heavily in debt, and that decided for him that he was going to have to rebel against Elizabeth and try and overthrow her. So he decided to try and seize power, and he needed a plan and supporters to help him. We'll look at those events on the next slide. The Earl of Essex gathered 300 supporters together, made up of a few unsuccessful courtiers and disgruntled soldiers. He then began to fortify his mansion. Elizabeth had ordered 4 members of the Privy Council to go and arrest Essex, but he arrested them instead and took them hostage. Essex then started a rebellion and marched to London. Now, he was hoping that on his march to London that many Londoners would support him, and he was hoping that the rebellion would massively grow in size. However, he misjudged it and nobody did. He'd underestimated the support for Elizabeth. He then decided, despite the fact that he didn't have very much support, he was going to march on the Queen's Palace at Whitehall, intending to capture Elizabeth, but he failed to do this. Robert Cecil decided to label Essex as a traitor and cleverly said that anybody that deserted him would be pardoned. That meant that many of the rebels that had been part of it from the beginning decided to drop out of the march, knowing that it wasn't going to be successful. Essex then returned to his house to find that the hostages had been released, and so he'd lost the only power that he had. Elizabeth's government then arrested Essex and his remaining supporters, and the rebellion only lasted a mere 12 hours. As a result of his actions, Essex was beheaded afterwards, and several other rebels were executed too, although some of them escaped with a fine. Elizabeth therefore made it clear, even late in her reign, that she would not tolerate any challenges to her authority. Now, it's important to also think about to what extent this event was really a threat to Elizabeth, and think about its significance. Now, in terms of how much support it had, the lack of popular support meant it wasn't actually that much of a threat for her. However, it did suggest that her authority over the court had become weaker towards the end of her reign. She was no longer using that system of patronage so effectively. If she had, then the Earl of Essex would have never started that rebellion, because his main issue with Elizabeth was how she had promoted Robert Cecil. The conflict at court in the 1590s also made her government less effective. The fact that there is constant competition and infighting made it more difficult to get decisions and things done. But we can think about the fact that the failed rebellion showed that despite Elizabeth's problems, the loyalty to the Queen remained firm. People could have joined it, but they chose not to, which shows that Elizabeth was still popular with the majority of ordinary people. We've now talked through all of the knowledge from Unit 1. Now, obviously, this is looking at the court and Parliament and her government over time, so it's not done in chronological order. Here I've just made a quick timeline of some key dates that you might want to be aware of. You might want to write these down. The last thing to be aware of is your short answer test on Elizabeth Part 1. Now, you should have made these flashcards already, and you can use these to help you revise. If you don't have these flashcards, then you can ask me for a copy and I can give some to you. It will also be on Show My Homework to be able to use as well.